In the previous video, we looked at a nested function, which is a function inside of a function. Now, that was done very briefly, and it was just so that we can go ahead and complete out the introduction to JSX portion of the main concepts on the React documentation. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually move over to rendering elements. Now, similar to the clock that we already built inside of our code sandbox, we're going to build another clock in a slightly different way. It's a variation of the way that we did it in the sandbox. Now, some of the elements are going to be kind of the same, but we're going to tweak some of the documentation so that we can make it work here. And inside here, the function, we're going to call it tick. We're not going to pass any parameters since we don't really have to have anything go through it. And inside of this function, we're going to make one variable called element. And inside this element, we're going to do an open parentheses since we want it to return this JSX immediately. And we're going to build a div. Inside of that div, we're going to have an h1. And underneath that h1, we're going to have an h2. For the first h1, we're going to do hello world, just like the documentation calls for. And underneath that, we're going to put it is some curly braces. And just like we did it in the code sandbox, we're going to do new date. We're going to do that as a function. And then we're also going to translate it to a local time string. But we're also going to have to invoke that no number inside of it. And at the end of this second curly brace, we're going to add a period. And before we can get anything going, similar to the React DOM.render up here, we're going to do the very same thing, React DOM.render. And then inside here, we're going to call this element that is inside of this function. And we're just going to do document dot. We're going to get the element by the ID, but instead of doing root like the documentation is calling for, what we're going to do is we're going to create a separate div and call it clock. So we're going to hit a quick save on here. Now, just as you're seeing, not really much going on. We'll refresh the page just to make sure. Underneath this function, since we're wanting to invoke it, I'm going to do set interval, just like our example inside of Code Sandbox. We're going to call the function tick, and we're going to call that function every second, or every 1,000 milliseconds. So as we have this here, we're going to hit save one more time. And we're going to go back to that index.html. We're going to make one more div, but this time we're going to use an emit tool to do ID. And as you can see, the emit abbreviation, ID, is inside that div. We're going to hit tab real quick. Actually, we didn't want to call it ID. We meant to call it clock. Excuse me. So here we go. We have a new div right underneath the root div. We're going to give it the ID clock. And from our index.js, we're going to hit that save real quick. And as you can see, the hello world is here. It is. And the clock is right there. We'll look at it one more time just so that we can quickly go over it. Here's the function. The function inside, or excuse me, the element inside. We want this JSX to return with a new date and a local time string, as you can see here. And instead of calling that root element, what we're doing is we made a separate one underneath it and called it clock. That way it's a little bit easier to just immediately look at it and, okay, this is what it's connected to. Right at the bottom, we have the set interval of 1000 milliseconds, and we're going to be running that function every 1000 milliseconds. So that gives us a functional clock working on the side. So that's going to be it for this section. We're going to look at components and props next. I hope to see you there.